Good morning and welcome to the Durbar Hall. Amazing to see you all up bright and early, but how could you resist? Today, we have Christopher de Bellaigue. Christopher, thank you. It is so much fun to share the stage with you and to get to talk about a marvelous project that we are 1 out of 3 steps into. But before we get into the Lion House, my first question really is, I know you as a modern historian. You have written on Mossadegh. You've written on the Kurds of Turkey. You've written on the Islamic Enlightenment. I was very surprised when I was first sent the galleys of the Lion House to see you take a deep dive into the classical age of Ottoman history. So what took you back to Suleiman and the age of Suleiman?
Thank you, Eugene. I'm going to just say namaste. जब भी भारत आता हूँ मेरा दिल खुशी से भर जाता है लेकिन अपनी हिंदी को भूल गया. That's all I'm going to say. Eugene, Eugene, thank you. Eugene is one of the best Arabists around, so if you need anything in colloquial Arabic, Eugene will supply.
Which is no use here. I never get to use my Arabic in Jaipur.
Your question is why I went for this.
What drew you to the life and age of Suleiman?
As a historian, I think, and I'm a historian and I deal with the present at the same time, so I oscillate between what's happening in the here and the now and what happens in different ages. I've never been as far back as the 16th century, as you said. Suleiman struck me as someone who needed reappraisal and perhaps in a new style. He is someone who has received biographical attention in the past, but I live in a country that is obsessed with Henry VIII. Unjustifiably so, in my opinion. He receives way too much attention purely because of what he got up to in the bedroom. His significance as a world ruler was minimal. He had a significance at home because, of course, he ushered in the Reformation in England. But Suleiman was really someone who straddled the world, and I think we'll talk about that a bit today. His importance is really incontestable. And by looking at Suleiman, one can not only look at him as a person, as a ruler, someone who ruled for 46 years, a fantastically long period of time in that period, but also whose effect and influence and footprint was felt everywhere, from Sumatra to Frankfurt, from Gujarat to Algiers. And so I thought of this project as a way of using his life and times and getting as close as possible to Suleiman himself, also as a way of illuminating much wider realities and also dipping in to a whole range of geographies and cultures at the time in a way that you can do with a world ruler who lived for 46 years, and as a result, his reign overlapped with those of so many other interesting and important people.
Which is why he's known to the West admiringly as Suleyman the Magnificent, but of course known to his own empire and to the Arab world as the lawgiver, Kanuni. But you're touching on one of the things that makes reading about this era so interesting, which is, as Westerners, we tend to come to the history of the global South assuming the superiority of Europe. But this was not the case. You open your story in April of 1522 with a kind of emergency meeting of the sharing of intelligence in the halls of power of Venice. And in a sense, we're almost looking at Suleiman and the Ottoman world through the eyes of the Venetians, the rich, the powerful, the cosmopolitan, but very weak militarily, Venetians. And they're very worried about what's going on with an empire that seems to be hoarding the riches and building the military might to make war on Europe. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the disparity of power?
It's important, I think, to stress that to a certain extent, when you're appraising Suleiman and his performance as a sultan, and he is known as the Magnificent because the Ottoman power at that time seemed to be unassailable. Riches, power, military might, administrative competence, on all of these levels, the Ottomans reached their apogee under Suleiman. But it's important to stress that he really lucked out because he came to the throne at a time when Christendom was deeply divided. It was now being riven by the Reformation. Europe was turning on itself. The European states were fighting each other. And at the same time, his father had incorporated enormous territories into the Ottoman Empire. And so he came to power. The third way he came to power in a very lucky fashion was that he was unopposed. And he didn't need to kill anyone. He didn't have any siblings to kill in order to come to power because his father was so bloodthirsty that he had killed them all. So the bloodshed essentially had happened before Suleiman was in a position to assume power. He came to power at a very young age. And the Venetians, as you say, Eugene, were an extraordinarily successful maritime colonial empire spread in these little pinpricks around the world from which they controlled this extraordinary maritime trade. And with the rise of the Ottomans, everyone said, well, the Ottomans, they can't really sail. They don't really know about water. But with time, the Ottomans did learn about water, and they became incredibly adept at controlling the oceans. And that meant an enormous challenge to the Venetians. And so the story starts with, as you say, an emergency meeting. The Ottomans are, and the Venetians are incredible. They're very good for the historian because they provide granular accounts of the enemy. And they are fantastic intelligence gatherers. Particularly for the way that I wrote the book, this was very helpful because I write the book in a way that is slightly novelistic in its style. And so
slightly. Totally novelistic. This is history that you can't put down, that you keep turning page after page because it's so rich and gossipy. And those Venetians were amazing gossips.
They were terrible gossips, and they prided themselves when they had ambassadors in Constantinople. They prided themselves on knowing what went on in the imperial bedroom. How did they do that? They had access to eunuchs who were working in the imperial, in the new palace, and also they would have had contact with Jewish handmaidens who were serving the members of the harem. And so through these and also their contacts with Ottoman statesmen, they managed to find out what was going on, fleet movements, bowel movements, everything. They knew the lot.
So what happens is, again, I'm going to hold the book up because I want you to remember what it looks like so you can run out and get it. This is not history, guys. This is just the best fiction dressed up as nonfiction you're going to read all year. And Suleiman's not an unknown quantity. There's so many histories about him, and they usually are written in the vein we were starting out this conversation about military might and economic power and superstructural boredom. But your book, Suleiman comes through in a way like I've never read him before. And you're giving us a little hint because those gossipy Venetians getting into the bed sheets of everybody they wanted to report on. But you are able to describe what Suleiman looked like, at times what he thought or how he felt. How were you able to paint such an intimate portrait of a man who lived 400 years ago?
When you're writing a conventional history, and I've written many conventional histories, there are times when you might withdraw and you would say, at this stage it is possible to imagine that Eugene would have thought this. It would have been surprising if he had not done that. And you surmise and you guess. In fact, I avoided that completely. I write in the present tense. Everything I do, everything I say about Suleiman is based on textual sources. How do I do that? Because I know what people are saying about him. We also have a number of letters that he wrote, very intimate letters, love letters to his wife, his beloved concubine Hürrem, who subsequently became his wife. And we also have Ottoman chroniclers. And then we have, I think, and we're talking about a man who lives 46 years, who comes to the throne as a young man, in awe of his father, terrified of his father.
Who tried to kill him.
Yes, who tried to kill him. He sent him a poisoned robe, but the attendant tried it on instead. His father was a serial killer. Suleiman was a much more, by nature, a much more, I wouldn't say a pacific personality, but a less brutal personality and had a much greater family sense. We can draw all of these things together, and I did my utmost to bring him to life, again, as you say, by describing the way he looked. There are two ways that Suleiman gets angry. I know that because I came across both of them. The first is just to look at you until you just crawl away to the nearest hole. And the second is to bawl at you. And I think that actually the first shows he's more angry than the second. But that's one of the things. And I was at a talk yesterday, a novelist was talking about this kind of bifurcation, this dilemma. Do you write a novel of the bedroom or a novel of the arena? And the trilogy that I'm writing about, Suleiman, I try and do both. I try and get the broadest possible perspective, but also continually relate it to what's going on in his private life, in his family life, which as he goes on, becomes more and more conflicted, more and more tragic, more and more violent.
Well, let's take a dive there, because we have a book in the Lion House that is just so rich for the human characters, the three-dimensional human characters that fill that stage. And we get to know Suleiman as much through his lovers as we do through his own life. And he has two major lovers that come through the Lion House. And one is a man and one is a woman. Let's begin with the man, Ibrahim the Frank.
The Ottoman Empire at the time relied for an influx of talent in the form of slaves. The Ottoman Empire was constantly expanding. It was programmed for success. As a great scholar of Islam once said, the religion itself was. It was animated by a single ideal, that of conquest, and then of trading, and then of administration. And Suleiman was in a position where he could avail himself of the talents of a huge, constant, and unending influx of slaves. One of these was called Pietro, and he was a little boy who was playing on a beach in Albania when some slave traders arrived. They captured him, they kidnapped him, they took him away. And something like 10 years later, he found himself in the household of a rich widow living near the then Crown Prince, Suleiman. They were roughly the same age, almost exactly the same age. And when Suleiman received the news that his father had died of the plague, we think, and he was summoned to Istanbul, he went in great trepidation because he didn't know if his father really was dead, and he didn't know if his father, who was of an extremely suspicious disposition, harbored aggressive designs against him. He turns up at Istanbul with this young man who is now called Ibrahim, and who is distinguished for his enormous talents, his zest for life, his love of languages, his musical ability, an incredibly attractive personality, also highly ambitious.
But very ugly. I mean, you talk about a snaggletooth man who had a sort of twisted face.
He was not a looker. He wasn't like you, Eugene. But he arrives in Istanbul with this other boy, and all his father's pashas who are saying, well, we've got this callow youth who's arriving at Istanbul. We'll make mincemeat of him. We'll just carry on as things were in his father's reign. He arrives and they think, well, who's this other guy? And this other guy turns out to be incredibly important because he is, when you arrive to take up the throne of the Ottomans and you are completely alone and your mother is in the harem a few miles down the road, you need an ally. And so he promotes Ibrahim to an extent that was utterly unprecedented at the time. He promoted Ibrahim to all sorts of positions within the Imperial Palace administration and then ultimately to the Grand Vizierate. All of this was a complete novelty and a complete innovation. And of course, such was their closeness that we have sources attesting to the fact that they slept together. These, again, are Venetian sources. Whatever the nature of the relationship, it was extremely, extremely close. And of course, this aroused much jealousy on the part of the pashas whom he'd inherited from his father.
But just to try and give more depth to the relationship. You describe how, because of the fratricidal rules of Ottoman succession, Suleiman grew up with no brothers. He had no uncles by the same rules. In a sense, Ibrahim the Frank is filling a lot of different roles, a lot of different gaps in the man. And so not only is he someone you can trust when you go to Istanbul, not knowing if you're being drawn into a trap, but he fills the lack of siblings or of male relations in the family. It is love and trust bound together in a way which is very touching, actually. There's something, again, quite intimate and loving about the relationship as you describe it.
I think in these early days, I think for the first 10 or 15 years of their partnership, it was an extraordinarily close relationship, and one that really flummoxed and perplexed many foreigners and Turks as well. But as you say, it's completely linked to this appalling decree that Suleiman's great-grandfather, Mehmet the Conqueror, had issued, which essentially says, he who is destined to be the Sultan of the Ottomans has the legal right to kill all his male siblings. Now, Suleiman's father took that to an excessive degree. He didn't simply kill his male siblings. He had 10 surviving sisters. So that gives you an idea of how many male siblings he must have killed. But he also killed his nephews, and he left no one else standing. And I think that this had a great effect on Suleiman, because when he came to form a family with the second great love of his life, he would make it an extremely populous family. And he wasn't interested in killing his children. And when ultimately he found himself ensnared by the Ottoman law of succession, it was only with the greatest reluctance that he unleashed a bloodbath that dominates the second part of the trilogy and the middle part of his career, and really tarnishes his name as a result. It's a very interesting psychological setup.
So let's turn to the other great love in Suleiman's life, who again emerges from the pages of your book as a very human being. And this is, of course, going to be another slave who enters the palace through the way that women did, which is as concubines, with no promise of getting any particular favor. And just like Ibrahim, not the most beautiful woman in the harem section of the palace, and yet someone who was able to capture the heart of Suleiman, the Ruthenian slave woman we know as Roxolana. The Turks know as Hürrem.
Absolutely. And if you go to, in Ukraine, in what is now Western Ukraine, there is a town where you will find a somewhat fanciful sculpture of Roxolana, because we don't know exactly what she looked like, because from the moment she entered the harem, she was unavailable for consultation. But we know how important she was. She was captured by Tatar slave traders. She was sold at Kaffa on the, or Theodosia on the Crimean Sea. She was shipped across the Black Sea on the Crimean. She was shipped across the Black Sea to Istanbul, where she was sold to the Imperial harem in the slave market there. And she very quickly distinguished herself through her acumen, through her charm, through her ability to pick up all the skills you needed to if you were going to attract the Sultan's attention. All of those, the aesthetic, the religious, all sides of the Ottoman character were to some extent perfected in the form of Hürrem. She had a rival, and this was a concubine called Mahidevran, who was generally considered to be better looking than her. But the thing about Mahidevran was that she was hot-headed, and she didn't know how to respond when this threat arrived. And so one day, the two of them meet each other in the corridors of the harem, and Mahidevran says to Hürrem, "How dare you get ahead of yourself? You are nothing but sold meat." And Hürrem gives a reply, and then Mahidevran scratches her and pulls out tufts of her hair. And Hürrem responds in a very interesting way. When the Sultan next summons her to his bedchamber, she sends her regrets. And the eunuch tells the Sultan that Hürrem cannot come because she's not in a fit state to be seen by him. This piques his curiosity, so he insists that she come. She comes, and weepingly, shedding a tear, she describes what happened at the hands of Mahidevran. Suleiman summons Mahidevran, says, "What is all this?" And Mahidevran, instead of apologizing, instead of softening the Sultan's ire, says, "The new woman got what she deserved. In fact, she deserved more." And that's the end of Mahidevran, and she is banished forever. And this sets up the defining enmity and the defining hostility that will animate the rest, or much of the rest of Suleiman's reign, because Mahidevran has a son. And from very early on, the question is, even when Suleiman is young, vigorous, full of life, full of health, the question is already who's going to succeed and who will die when he does so.
But these are huge questions of power, and they're not particular to the Ottoman Empire. The Queen Mother wanting to see their child succeed the father to the throne, and in that way to retain their power. We are talking about a kind of dynastic battle of the titans between Mahidevran and Hürrem.
Absolutely. And gradually as we go through the book, and particularly into the second book, The Golden Throne, we start to find the anticipation of what will come next starts to permeate all the diplomatic reports. Everyone is starting to talk about how this will end up, because everyone knows it's going to end up very badly. Suleiman and Hürrem have no fewer than 5 sons, 4 of whom are able-bodied. The one disabled one, who's a delightful boy called Jahangir, is out of the succession because, according to Ottoman statutes, you cannot come to the throne if you're not able-bodied. And at the same time that Suleiman is bestriding the world, he is leaving on campaign most summers, or every other summer. These campaigns last 6 or 7 months. When he's not on campaign, he's writing to Hürrem. We have love letters between the two. And when he's back, he's making more babies. And I very strongly feel that there is a denialism within that relationship, a denialism of the ultimate tragedy that will come eventually to beset them. And one has a sense that alongside this relationship with Ibrahim, which slowly sours, and Hürrem was definitely a part of that souring, alongside that relationship with Ibrahim, you have almost a sense of a quite ordinary family being formed, with Hürrem listing the names of the children, saying essentially, they all send you lots of love. She doesn't put it quite that way. She basically says they long to find themselves under the dust under your foot. But this is what it amounts to. Lots of love from the kids, and you have a kind of tantalizing glimpse of that domesticity that is denied people of that rank.
It's, again, one of the things that's so satisfying about the book, particularly when one looks at the early modern age, is you never get a woman's own voice. And yet the letters, and you quote them extensively, are an insight into this woman who had to learn the Turkish that she writes to her husband in. And as you say, the early letters are a little rough. Well, forgive the learner what it takes to master the fine rhetoric of the language. But there is a sense of her voice that allows you to get a sense of who she was too.
There are 2 ways that we get to know Hürrem, really. The first, as I said, because none of the foreigners can ever see her, so we never get a direct account of an encounter with Hürrem. We always have to do it from an oblique angle. So the letters are absolutely vital, and they give a very strong sense of an extremely bubbly, extremely exuberant personality. I wouldn't say low maintenance. I would say she was quite high maintenance, high octane, but fantastically loving, fantastically affectionate. That is the first kind of route into Hürrem. The second route into Hürrem is as she gets richer, as she gets more powerful, as she gets, she does things that no one has done. The way that she manages to marry Suleiman is fantastic. Basically, one day,
because slaves don't marry the sultans.
No,
Sultans don't have queens.
No, they don't have queens. But Hürrem is really interested in becoming a philanthropic benefactor. She wants to build lots of pious foundations. She wants to help the poor. She wants to be like Zubaydah, who was the great queen of Baghdad, who helped all the pilgrims get to Mecca. She built Zubaydah's Way, this 1,000-kilometer long road to Mecca, and she was incredibly philanthropic and famous for that. And so Hürrem says, well, I want to be like that. I've now got the means because I'm on a fantastically high stipend. And she goes to the Mufti and says, if I start building philanthropic foundations, will that help me when I die, and will it help me go to heaven? And he shakes his head sadly and says, well, sadly, it won't. It will only help your owner, the Sultan. And so that sends her into a real tailspin. And she gets so sad that the Sultan realizes he's got to do something, so he issues a decree for her manumission. So she becomes a free woman. But still, she hasn't quite got what she wants. She's a free woman, and she's in the Sultan's bed. And according to Islamic law, you cannot be a free woman and in the Sultan's bed. So the Sultan sends her word, and he says, how about it? And she says, well, it surprises me, Your Honor, that you don't know the rudiments of Islamic law. You cannot sleep with a free woman who is not your wife without committing the gravest of sins. And so this is how she becomes the Sultan's wife, which is a great novelty. She moves into the new palace, so she is in physical proximity to the Sultan. She needs only step through a door, and she is in his quarters. She has a control and an influence over the Sultan that is almost unprecedented in the Ottoman Empire.
So tell us more about what goes on between Ibrahim and Roxolana, because obviously this is, two very powerful love relations focusing on the same man, the Sultan. You hinted that the relations between them sour.
They were always going to be rivals, I think. And Ibrahim, when he becomes Grand Vizier, and the Ottoman Empire is expanding on all fronts, I think it's worth just briefly describing the extent of this expansion and where it happens. In the Lion House, you see this expansion into Hungary, you see campaigns into Iran, you see the enrollment of and the building of an enormous fleet that threatens Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire, and his Holy Roman Empire throughout the Mediterranean. And so the expansion that was begun under Suleiman's father, Selim, is continued. And as I mentioned, there are campaigns virtually every year. And the European powers, the Christian powers, are justifiably obsessed with Ottoman military might. This brings Ibrahim to the fore, and he becomes, because he was born a Venetian citizen and he speaks Italian, the Venetians think that they can use him to their advantage. The Venetians are incredibly good at bribery. They're incredibly good at buttering up Ibrahim, and they think in him they have an ally. They can maintain that special relationship between Venice and the Ottomans so that the Ottomans will allow the Venetians to continue trading. And this works for a while. The problem is that Ibrahim does what many Grand Viziers do, what many prime ministers do. They start to think that they're more important than their boss. And so Ibrahim starts boasting that he's as well dressed as his boss. If the Sultan wants something done and he doesn't want it done, Ibrahim's way, Ibrahim will have his way. And this starts to permeate through, and it starts to get back to the Sultan. And then malicious whispers start that Ibrahim, in fact, has designs on the throne. He's got so big for his boots. And to an extent in the Lion House, Ibrahim is so powerful that he, to some extent, effaces Suleiman. And Suleiman remains remote, and he remains inaccessible because Suleiman is so accessible. He's the public face of the Ottoman Empire. And so ultimately what happens, And we have no documentary evidence for this. But
You're not going to spoil the book, are you?
Of course I'm going to spoil the book.
Spoiler alert to the audience here. If you want to know how the book ends.
I'll gloss over. The climax of their rivalry, and exactly how it came about. No, you're so right, Eugene, as ever. I'm just going to shut up.
Well, no, I mean, there is a sense of, there's a plot to this book.
There is a plot, yeah.
And it does have a climax to it. And it involves these characters that you've gotten to know so well and you feel so connected to that I wouldn't actually want to take away the pleasure for you that, you know, let's move on. Let's move on. Because there's so much more to be said. We haven't even touched on the richest of the Venetian characters you bring to this, Alvisegriti, the bastard son of the Doge of Venice, who has loyalties to Venice, to the Ottoman Empire, and to himself. And obviously those are going to come into conflict. Again, this book is just peopled with the most incredible characters that I promise you will not want to put it down. And when you do finally come to the tragic end of the book, Christopher's organized the book in 5 acts, which tells you the dramatist is already at work here. But don't worry, because like other great works, one thinks of the 3 parts of Henry IV. There's a trilogy here, and the second one is in galleys now. It is called The Golden Throne. And in this, we pick up the story where it leaves off in the Lion House. And in this book, we actually get to bring the story to India. So tell us a little bit about how the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire's ambitions actually drew him to South Asia.
It was always a source of regret to the Ottomans that the Portuguese controlled the trade routes to the east. They naturally regarded these trade routes as theirs. They'd lost out in the Americas because the Spanish and the Portuguese were already established, already shipping gold back and silver back from the mines of the Americas. They didn't want to lose out on the trade routes to the east. And India was clearly pivotal to this. The year is 1538, and it's 3 years after Humayun's, the Mughal Emperor Humayun's inconclusive attempt to annex Gujarat. Bahadur Shah, the Sultan of Gujarat, has been assassinated by the Portuguese, who were ensconced at Goa. And before he was assassinated by the Portuguese, he handed over a great sum of money to the Sultan's safekeeping. He had wind of his potential end. And so a huge quantity of gold was deposited with the Sultan's into the Sultan's safekeeping at Mecca. And of course, we should remember that the pilgrimage routes to Mecca were under Ottoman control and were hugely important. In 1538, Suleiman Pasha, who is not to be confused with Sultan Suleiman, who was an extraordinary character, a vast eunuch who needed 4 men to be lifted out of his chair, and a man of legendary cruelty. A really very nasty piece of work, but also a quite brilliant administrator. He'd risen from service in the palace and had become an administrator and a general. He raised a fleet at Suez. He had to do this using ingenuity that even now I find really hard to credit. There was, of course, no route from Suez, from the Mediterranean to Suez. He had to bring all the materials for this 80-strong fleet down the Nile and then drag them across 80 miles of desert to Suez, where they were assembled. Then they set off from Suez down the Red Sea. They took Yemen on the way, and then they crossed to Diu. And Diu was their landing point. They had a local ally called Hoja Safar, and they had reason to believe that they would be made welcome at Diu. There were quite a few Rumis living on the west coast of India at the time, and Rumi denotes a relationship with Rome, but not the Rome of St. Peter's, the Rome of Constantinople. And a lot of these traders or seafarers had washed up in Gujarat because there was an enormous amount of wealth that they wanted to get to be a part of. Hoja Safar was one of these. He was of Italian origin. He'd converted to Islam. And he said to the Ottomans, come and I'll help you. And so Suleiman Pasha lands his force at Diu, and he needs to take the fort in order to be safe from the Portuguese fleet that is approaching from Goa. Suleiman Pasha has one failing as a commander, and that is that he is a coward. He directs operations from the poop of a ship that lies offshore. He is never seen. On the other hand, the defenders fight with a fanatical courage. And the scenes that we have of the battles over the fort at Diu are really shocking, actually. They come from Portuguese and Italian sources. The Italians having some of them being taken along as mercenaries or as enslaved Ottoman soldiers. After a while, Hoja Safar, the local comprador, gets bored of the Ottomans. Suleiman Pasha, his ostensible ally, is arrogant. The Ottomans clearly are not interested in just putting Hoja Safar on the throne of Gujarat. They want a toehold that will allow them to create some kind of imperial dominion in India. And so he starts to sow the seeds of doubt in Suleiman Pasha, and he says that the Portuguese are just around the corner, they're just over the horizon, you'd better get on with it. Suleiman Pasha does not know how close he is to reducing the fort of Diu. The fort of Diu probably has 100 and 150 fighting men left. Women and children are doing much of the heavy lifting in what remains of the fort. And there's one final assault that is launched at night, continues the following day. So much destruction and damage that, according to one Portuguese eyewitness, brother met brother and fled because they thought that each other thought that the other was a ghost. So covered were they in debris, so battle begrimed. Anyway, Suleiman Pasha eventually loses his nerve, and he sails away, and he sails back to Istanbul, where he is rewarded for his annexation of Yemen with a place on the Imperial Council. But if we think about that year, and we think that Humayun has not complete control over northern India, that he's actually quite soon going to be forced out and forced into exile in Iran. And you think that the Portuguese have not yet consolidated their control along Western India, that the British East India Company has not yet been formed, and the French have yet to show an interest in India. It is possible in that tantalizing window of opportunity to think that had Suleiman Pasha held on for another day and actually taken the fort, then the history of India could have been very different.
Can you imagine? So instead of the Raj, you would have gotten the Sublime Porte. Rajasthan would have been Sultanistan. Well, you were within a whisker of becoming part of a greater Ottoman world.
Yeah, I'm for better or for worse.
Now, my little countdown clock tells me we have 5 minutes left. Our team here has said there's a 5 minutes leeway. And I look at this enormous audience, and I suspect there are questions. The hands have already gone up. So, Christopher, with your permission, I'm going to stop peppering you with questions now and give your audience a bit of a chance. And if we have a roving mic, I see 2 hands here, I see 2 hands there. If we could start with the gentleman with the glasses right here in the second row.
Thank you for the amazing lecture. I have 2 questions. We could see the millenarian currents in the Ottoman Empire, especially in the reign of Selim and his son Suleiman. I want you to highlight how this actually entered into his personal life and reflects in his personal life. And second, if you could highlight the possible
Can I keep you to just one question, just so everyone can ask? Just the one. I'm so sorry.
So the millennial currents within Ottoman life, I deal with that principally through something called the golden apple. And the golden apple was a golden apple that is suspended somewhere in Christendom. And we're not entirely sure where it is suspended. The tradition of the golden apple goes back a very long time. It predates Suleiman by a long time. And when he sets out on campaign into Christendom, he always says to his janissaries, "We will meet at the golden apple." And the golden apple is something that really, I think, is a metaphor for achievement in this world, so riches in this world, and also the favor of God. So a free pass to heaven in the next. And the Ottoman Empire is a mixture of material desire and also spiritual fulfillment. And the two, for the time that the Ottoman Empire is expanding, are completely in harmony and completely in sync with each other. So and of course we have millennial. There are constant predictions of the end of the world. There are constant predictions of a certain date following the conquest of Constantinople, where things of great importance will happen. And these form an undercurrent.
And I saw another hand back here. Right there. There we go.
Fascinating talk. Thank you. My question is, what was the nature of the people who were defending against Suleiman Pasha? What was the composition of that force? Were they mostly Indians, Portuguese, Ottoman, or people from Central Asia?
That's a very good question. My understanding is that they were mostly Portuguese, but with some Indian allies. The Portuguese were not welcome. They had expelled Bahadur Shah, the Sultan then of Gujarat, and so they had alienated a lot of Gujaratis. And Hoja Safar, who was going to be the Ottoman ally in the attack, brought with him a number of Gujaratis, particularly Muslim Gujaratis, who would help. So my impression from the sources is that this was it was a battle between the Ottomans and the Portuguese fought on Gujarati soil, but obviously with enormous ramifications for ordinary Gujaratis, most of whom had fled from the scene of the battle and from Diu.
And we have two questions over here, right next to each other, conveniently.
Good morning, sir. My question to you is that, what advice would you like to give to the writers who are aiming to cover historically or culturally diverse topics with respect and depth?
Read Eugene.
Read Christopher's.
I'm going to answer that serious question in a serious manner. My advice is to find a topic that you can do that is very close to your heart, and try and do it in a different way from the way that has been done before. Try and bring something new to the topic. That could be in terms of information. It could be in terms of the style that you use to write. That would be and of course the most important thing is never lose hope.
And find the right sources. You couldn't have written this without such rich and wonderful sources. So the sources do kind of guide where you can go.
If you're writing history, even if you write it as novel, you are entirely in the hands of the sources. You cannot make things up. You cannot insert characters when there's a lull in the action. You have to deal with that. So you have to find inventive ways of conducting your reader from one point of interest to another without being untrue to the history. But the great thing about history is that 99 times out of 100, it is more impactful, it is more eventful, it is more surprising than fiction. So, in fact, if you place yourself wholeheartedly in the hands of events, you can usually find a way through.
And we have one last question, please.
It's my pleasure to talk to you. So it's like my first time. So my question for you is, your writing often brings overlooked or misunderstood perspectives to light. What drives you to tell these stories?
And so many different stories.
They are perhaps because they are overlooked and not dealt with in sufficient depth. But having said that, I've never written anything that's, even as a journalist or as a historian, I've never written something that has never been written before by other people. But each time someone new takes on a subject, it takes on a new life and becomes something new because it is seen through the prism of someone else. So there is no such thing as the definitive account of any historical event. Historical events need to be constantly revisited according to the times in which they're written, according to the disposition of the author. Someone else could have written The Lion House or a book covering the same ground and done it in a completely different way, completely downplayed Ibrahim and Hürrem and concentrated on other aspects of the Ottoman experience.
Boring. I detect in these questions that there are members of the audience who will themselves be following down the road of writing such books. I hope you've taken inspiration from the example of Christopher de Bellaigue. Jaipur, can I ask you to give it up, please, for Christopher de Bellaigue? I'm inspired.
And also to Eugene, not least, his fantastic book is out there and waiting to be bought.
And I think Christopher is now available for signings.